Welcome to the scrutiny meeting for children and young people. I'm Tudor Thomas, new chair to this committee. I've been on the committee for 2 years, but obviously new to the role of chair. First and foremost, obviously welcome everybody. And also, I would really like to thank and to have on record, express my thanks and that of the committee to Martin Grocott, who so ably led this committee for the first 2 years of the council. And fortunately, Martin is still on the committee, and obviously we've still got his expertise, particularly in terms of ALN, etc. And obviously we'll be making use of that. Before we go into the main body of the agenda, obviously for the purposes of live streaming now, I'd like to go around, and if everybody just says who they are so that people watching at home will know who's speaking. As I say, I'm Tudor Thomas, Chair of CYP.
I'm Hazel Eilert, the Council Scrutiny Manager.
Wendy Barnard, Democratic Services.
Ed Price, EAS, Assistant Director, Strategy and Policy.
Kath Bevan, the Lead on Wellbeing and Equity for the EAS.
James Kent, Assistant Director, Curriculum Collaboration and Research, EAS.
Leanne Wakely, I'm the Chair of the Monmouthshire Association of School Governors.
Mike Fowler, Parent Governor Representative.
Councillor Maureen Powell, Councillor for Castle Ward and Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
Pete Strong, co-opted member from the National Education Union.
Councillor Louise Brown, Shire Newton Ward Councillor and member of this committee.
I'm Martin Grocott. I'm the member for Lansdowne Ward in Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
Councillor Laura Jones, Wisham Ward, and a member of this committee.
Councillor Joe Watkins, Caldecott Castle Ward, member of this committee.
Reverend Malcolm Lane, County Council for the Mardy, and a member of this committee.
Councillor David Davies in Kingsmark Ward, Chepstow, here today just to observe. Thank you.
Councillor Val Smith, Llanbadach Ward, observing.
Okay, thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr. We now go to the formal agenda, and firstly, number one, apologies. Sorry, Martin.
Thank you, Chair. Before we get into the formal agenda, I would like to raise the issue of the fact that minutes have not been prepared for this meeting. I've been attending meetings of education committees of various kinds since 1989. This is the very first time I have ever turned up at a meeting without any record of what we discussed at the previous meeting. I think that even if they'd been presented this morning in written form, that would have been fine. But when you consider that at our last meeting it was agreed that an agenda item today would be the service level agreements, the protocol between our schools and the authority, and that is not on the agenda. I think there may be a direct link here, and it's sloppy, and I would like it to be recorded with the Chief Executive, please, that we have no minutes of our previous meeting available. Okay, thanks, Councillor Grocott, for that. Your point is noted, and I will certainly take that up with the Chief Executive. But it is noted. Thanks very much. We go now then to apologies for absence.
Apologies from Elizabeth Thomas.
Can I put apologies, Councillor David Jones, who emailed me. Second point now then on the agenda, election of chair. Well, that, in a sense, has gone before, so that has gone through the full council. And unless there are any objections, yeah, I was black belt in origami, but there we are. Okay. Third point on the agenda now, appointment of vice chair. Are there any nominations for appointment of vice chair, please?
Thank you, Chair. I was very well served by my Vice Chair, and I would therefore like to propose that Councillor Laura Jones continues in that role.
I second that.
Are there any other nominations before we go to a show of hands? No one? Okay. Accepted? Yeah. We don't have to vote. Right. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest?
I promise I'm not going to carry on talking like this all morning, Chair. I would declare an interest as a governor at King Henry because I'm likely to make mention of that during the meeting.
Thanks.
I'm also a governor of King Henry VIII School, and that may come up within the debate.
Thanks. If anything else from other elected members arises, then obviously make that known at the time when we're looking at that particular agenda item, because that is a very important action to take. So thanks for that. In terms of 5 on the agenda, public open forum, I'm not aware of any member of the public wishing to address us this morning. Okay. Now then, number 6. This morning we've got 2 presentations, and we'll go to the first one. I'm very grateful. It's a presentation on educational attainment, strategy for improving the performance of free school meals pupils, and it's going to be given by Kath Bevan, Wellbeing Lead at EAS. Obviously, welcome you to this meeting this morning, and obviously look forward to your presentation. We've obviously had hard copies. It will come up on the screen as well. It is an area that has been discussed at length both in full council and in CYP, and it is a matter of concern, particularly performances at Key Stage 4. But I think you'll have some lively questions, but it would be good today to actually have some lively and hopefully fruitful discussion. So thanks very much for coming. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr, Chair. Bore da pawb. Before Cat starts, I've been asked to come along just to look at the data and almost provide a connection to, you'll have heard me talk about the performance data on several occasions in the past and the AS business plan. So I just wanted to talk to the first slide, really. Chair, as you say, when we look at performance of Monmouthshire FSM pupils, when we look at the blue bars, which are the Monmouthshire pupils relative to the light blue is the Monmouthshire, the dark blue is the Wales. You can see at foundation phase, Monmouthshire FSM pupils outperform their peers across Wales, although neither group do as well as their non-FSM counterparts. At Key Stage 2, it's similar, but the gap is closing. So that gap of performance of FSM pupils in Monmouthshire at Key Stage 2, the gap is not as great, pupils in Wales catching up with that. We recognise that in secondary, the reverse is true, where for the first time, Wales pupils outperform Monmouthshire FSM pupils, and then at Key Stage 4, the gap becomes more stark with Wales FSM pupils outperforming their peers in Monmouthshire to a more significant degree, almost 11 percentage points difference. There is, we know, as we go through education, a difference to... We have more pupils who are FSM in foundation phase than we do at Key Stage 4. As pupils move through Key Stage 4, they have been in poverty and disadvantage for a longer time if they remain FSM. There can be different circumstances at foundation phase when children are younger that can lead to that status, if that makes sense, and family issues. But we recognise that we have to do more to support our secondary schools to address the issues with FSM performance. Second slide, so that's the data, and I'm sure you may well have questions on that data later. Attendance, we also see patterns as well, which is where Kat's going to take over from me on the rest of the report.
Okay, good morning. If we look at the attendance of our FSM, non-FSM learners, the attendance at primary school has dropped since 14-15, and it's dropped more than the national average for Wales. The attendance in our secondary school has slightly increased, whereas the attendance across secondary school across Wales remained more stable. What's really important is that we start to unpick the attendance gap, especially within our secondary schools. So the table to the right just shows really, this was based on last year's data, the attendance gap between our free school meal children and our non-free school meal children. The gap within Monmouthshire obviously sits between the range of 3.5 to 6%. The range across the region is actually from 3.2% to 7.5%. So you can see roughly where some of those schools sit. It's all very important to show that as a region, we are there to support our schools address the progress of their vulnerable learners. And for the point of this morning's presentation, we're particularly going to look at the vulnerable group of learners of those who access free school meals. So within our strategic business plan, we are supporting our schools to raise the aspiration and improve pupils' outcomes of all learners, but making particular reference to our vulnerable learners. We're also supporting our schools to accelerate the improvement in schools and settings where improvement remains too slow. And some of our schools, that is particularly around the performance of our FSM pupils. On a regional basis, we have a wellbeing and equity strategy, and I'm going to take you through that so that you can really see the areas of work that we are supporting our schools to address over a 2-year period. And needless to say, if we look at the local priorities, within the Monmouthshire local priorities, the improvement of outcomes of the vulnerable learners, particularly our FSM learners, is highlighted as an area to work on. So if we think about the work that we're doing on a regional basis, all consortia have a regional lead for PDG, FSM, and PDG for LAC. I sit strategically within both of those roles, leading on the PDG FSM and working with a colleague on the performance of our LAC students. We also have a regional and wellbeing strategy group. That consists of representation from LAs, from the health board, from police, and that group is very much a reference group for all our work. We take it through those, make sure we're making links with other sectors before we put in a delivery plan to support our schools. We support our schools by providing them with data packs, breaking down the performance of their FSM, non-FSM learners, and we've started to use the attendance data in our professional panels where we've been discussing the PDG grant plans, and I'll come to that in a little while. We've run many grant planning workshops where schools and local authority colleagues were invited to attend, and across the region we had 785 professionals attend these regional workshops. We very much showed schools how to write a good grant plan, making sure it's targeting the performance of the FSM learners and using all the national and international data and research documents to inform their grant planning. We've devised a wellbeing and equity toolkit that's being used throughout the region and in many of your schools. This is providing the schools with a baseline of where they are with the wellbeing agenda within their school and guiding them of the next steps that they need to address. We've supported our governing bodies by providing grant planning workshops in LAs, but also on during the annual conference. And we've also provided our governors with question mats, really, of ideal questions to ask school leaders when they're sharing their grant plans with the governing bodies. We have invested in lead network schools for wellbeing and equity. We actually have 13 across the region, 6 with a focus on wellbeing, 6 with a focus on the more able and talented agenda, and a cluster around the performance of our LAC learners. And I'll talk about those a little bit later in the presentation. As I've already mentioned, we have representation on the Wellbeing and Equity Strategy Board, and therefore we are very much trying to develop a multi-team approach to supporting our schools and working very closely with Gwent Police, especially around the adverse childhood experiences agenda. Okay, if I just try to pull it into a direction really of how we've supported our schools. We know as a nation we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. We adopted the UN Rights of the Child and they feature in the areas of learning in the new curriculum. We know we've got the new education mission and the new curriculum rolling in. We know that's been supported by a new ESTIN framework. We've got the new Social Services and Wellbeing Act, and if that's not enough for all our schools to cope with, we've also got the new ALN bill rolling in. So as a region, we've tried to pull together all the important strands and the messages in those key areas of work. And we've produced, as I've said, our Wellbeing and Equity Strategy that reflects all those areas of work. That's supported with a Wellbeing Walk, which is the audit the schools do, just to basically, let's see where we are for all our learners, and let's prioritise the areas that we need to address over a 3-year school development plan. And that's obviously supported with a professional learning offer. It's okay us telling the schools what they need to do, but we actually need to scaffold and support them to achieve that. That then has focused the work on a cluster basis. We know working in cluster has a positive impact across our region. Last financial year, our clusters were given a Wellbeing and Equity grant to really develop, shape and start to embed this piece of work. And we did that through all schools and clusters having wellbeing leads in their school and addressing the ACES agenda. And that obviously is fed into individual schools. So if we look particularly about key elements of that strategy document, we need to identify effective practice within and beyond the region. There is an awful lot of documentation that comes out from Welsh Government, from ESTIN. There's evaluations with recommendations that schools, LAs and consortia need to embrace. But we also need to start to focus on regional research to ensure that what our schools are doing are meeting the needs of the demographic population. We are obviously need to be very effective in the way that we deliver our professional learning, and we use schools to co-deliver. We also use clusters to co-deliver, and we obviously buy in the experts in the areas that we need it. Our agenda is to address the provision of wellbeing and equity in all our schools and settings. And we have to use data. But we know our hard-level data doesn't always tell the true story of the performance of our most vulnerable learners. So it's really, really important that we support our schools to use the soft data to show the progress made that these vulnerable learners make over a long period of time. And we've got lots of pieces of work going on at the moment that I will come to in a moment. And obviously it's right that we keep our schools notified of the developments of the wellbeing and health and wellbeing area of learning, and how we can support those with future pieces of work. So this really I call the bubble diagram, just to keep things really simple. We recognise that schools can't do everything, and this isn't their only priority, especially with the whole national agenda and change going on in education at the moment. We support schools in developing wellbeing, the More Able agenda, linking to the Pre-16 SAREN project and the SAREN project, supporting with the Adverse Childhood Experiences that's come out from the ACE Hub in Bridgend, to focus on the performance of our FSM learners, our EOTIS learners and our LAC learners, and to provide our schools with support for the pupils who have English as an additional language. In addition to that, we realise that all of this work can't stop at the school gate, and therefore it's important for us to support our schools with family and community engagement and with the areas of curriculum. We very much present this model that you can see at the moment for schools to dip and dive into. We are not expecting all of these areas to be addressed in year 1 of their school development plan. However, we would like to see it feature over a 3-year period. They are elements of work that need to be picked up, addressed, re-looked at in all our schools and settings. So we're not just thinking this up. and working alone. As I said, we've got our Wellbeing and Equity Strategy Group that meets on a termly basis. They're an excellent reference group, and it's really important that we are complementing the work that's coming out from health, from police, from social care, to ensure we're not causing repetition for our schools, but also that we're not causing confusion for our schools. Underneath that strategy group, we have a Wellbeing Task and Finish group. Again, we have representations from each local authority, public health, head teacher representative and partner agencies, and the ALN Transformation Officer for the region attends those. They are very much, we sit, we work on a piece of work, and we make sure what it looks like for each LA, how each LA can complement and support the schools in the areas that the region can't. We then have our learning network schools that I've already spoken about, and we have Monmouthshire schools that are part of that reference group. And it is right that we don't complete any of this work on wellbeing and equity without going back to those learners and ensuring that we get their viewpoints and that they feel they have a voice in this area of work across the region. So we know we are committed as a consortia, as a region, to support our schools narrow the gap of our most vulnerable learners. When we're talking about narrowing the gap, we must be cautious that we're not capping the ability of those top ability students, because that's not our agenda. It's about progress and attainment for all learners, but ensuring that we are doing everything possible to keep our most vulnerable learners engaged and performing at a challenging level. We know that one of the large areas of money coming into the region is via the PDG grant. The PDG grant has different elements. It has its FSM element that is calculated on the number of FSM pupils. We have the LAC grant that is allocated on a cluster basis, and that is very much a feature for all our schools to be LAC prepared. We know that this is such a mobile group of learners, and even if a school hasn't got a LAC learner today, they could very much end up with a LAC learner tomorrow. So it's about being LAC prepared as much as being LAC active to support those most vulnerable learners in our schools. We also know that the PDG grant has an element to support those who are educated other than at school, and we also know that it supports our most vulnerable learners within our early years. So if we take the key element of that at the moment, the PDG FSM, the terms and conditions of the grant, we know it's eligible for all free school meal children, and Wales expanded their definition to the Ever 2 model. We know England operates at an Ever 6 model, but this has supported our schools of supporting those learners who were entitled to free school meals in July and come September, for whatever reasons, have lost that entitlement, but actually the income into the family home may have varied very little, but they are still challenged in the same areas they were a couple of months earlier. We also know that it's to support those children who are singly registered in PRUs and those who are educated other at school, but that's not through home election, okay? So key elements of the PDG grant, that schools must monitor all their interventions to ensure they are having necessary impact. We are being challenged more by Welsh Government to ensure that we are making progress in whatever way it's being formed for our most vulnerable learners, and we need to support and scaffold our schools to ensure that, one, the grant plan is really well written to target those vulnerable learners, but they're capturing the right data to show the impact that the interventions and projects are actually having an impact on those learners. As Welsh Government, they are very keen for us to use Set and Trust Toolkit, and we've worked in partnership with Welsh Government and with the Education Endowment Foundation to support our schools using the Set and Trust Toolkit, and I'll show you how we've done that in a later slide. We know that the PDG grant has to be targeted at least 60% into secondary schools Key Stage 3 learners. And that's very much the picture. You know, in primary education many years ago, it was all about early intervention, wasn't it? Let's get oracy and quality, rich language into nursery and reception, and you start to reap the benefits in years 4, 5 and 6. This is very much of the same type of ethos. Let's get it right in year 7 and 8 for these learners so that the gap narrows as they move through their secondary school experience. If we look a little closer at the LAC Cluster Grant, the LAC Cluster Grant is very much to encourage school-to-school working, and we know that's a national agenda. It's to be used for projects that raise attainment, improve attendance, reduce the exclusion, develop enhanced curriculum opportunities, because some of these learners are just not ready to sit in a large class and access a full educational day because their level of resilience is on a par with a child who has had a more stable start to their life. Therefore, we need to support our schools to create structures and environments within their school to support the looked after and known adopted learners. It's about having those quality interventions, and again, it's going back to what I've already mentioned, ensuring that that's recorded appropriately in our plans and likewise evaluated. It's about building capacity in our school to meet the needs of all our vulnerable learners. And with every grant that comes into the area, we have to show that the expenditure is around areas that becomes sustainable beyond the life of the grant. And that's one of our biggest challenges for our schools. What can't it be used for? And it's important just to pick up on these 3 points, really. All schools have to have a designated LAC teacher. In Wales, it has to be a teacher. In England, it's not got that stipulation. That is a statutory role, and therefore, if there is funding that needs to be aligned to that role, that needs to come from core school budgets. However, the LAC grant can be used to upskill and train that designated lead. And obviously, if any of you have attended the recent governor's training, our recommendation is that we also have a designated governor lead for our looked after children. The next point really is a real grey and challenging area. It can't be used to replace existing services or entitlements for the ALN pupils. However, if that ALN pupil has trauma and attachment issues, it can provide the intervention to meet that area. And we've had to have long discussions with some of our schools to really unpick what that looks like. It cannot cover what would have been covered via a statement of an ALN pupil. And it obviously has to be, the cluster has to produce robust plans that are sit and complement the regional work around wellbeing and equity. So what have we done to date? So far this term, we've provided our school with grant terms and conditions and a guidance document of how to write their grant plan, but also how to evaluate their grant plan. We've provided them with a grant planning tool, which is an Excel spreadsheet. Everything is a drop-down menu. It becomes very easy, but for us as a regional basis, it's a really good tool for us to pull together the necessary data that we need to feed back to Welsh Government in a timely manner. We have then created professional panels to approve school plans, and I'm going to come on to those in a little while. And there is an expectation that by the end of November and the end of March in 2020, that schools have completed their evaluations and they come back to that professional panel to discuss the impact that their plans have had. So for Monmouthshire, we've held the professional grant panel, particularly looking at the FSM learners. We're due to hold the one looking at LAC learners later this week. There was EAS representation and local authority representation. In total, we went through 13 school plans, all for secondary schools, and randomly selected primary, special and PRU plans. And we literally did bring up each school plan and go through the activities line by line. What does that look like? What does that mean for that vulnerable learner in the school? Does it have a measurable output? As you can see, it created lots of discussion, and head teachers were welcome to attend and talk us through our plan. From that meeting, we approved 6 plans. They were very robust plans. 2 need minor tweaking, which they've completed, and those have now been approved. 5 plans needed significant areas of work, and that could be that it wasn't focused enough on the FSM learners within that school. We felt that the intervention or the project wasn't robust enough to continually identify and work with that vulnerable group of learners, or we felt that the measurable success didn't match what should have come out of that intervention. So we've gone back to the schools, we've provided them with support to address those areas in their grant plan, and they're now re-invited back to a discussion group with their Chair of Governors, and they're due to take place in June. As I said, there is so much going on out there, so much advice, recommendation, and that comes from Welsh Government and Estyn. Also, schools have an awful lot of international research to use at their fingertips. They also have a lot of organisations and companies from across the border that are coming in wanting to engage and work with their schools. So as a region, we've tried to make sense of that and make it more manageable for the schools, try to ensure that we've pulled out the important parts, made the recommendations to school leaders of what they should read, what would be useful to read, and what to read if you get time to. As I've already mentioned, we're using the Sutton Trust as a guidance tool. It's not the only measure that we are using, but schools are using this as, finding this as a useful tool. This slide really shows that we are encouraging schools to direct the areas of expenditure within their plans within that slide. All of those areas show that they have measurable impact using the Sutton Trust. And to help our schools, this year we've RAG rated the Sutton Trust. So we are guiding our schools to direct their expenditure within the top 2 colour bands. Some of them have picked up some of the 3rd colour band and justified why they need to direct their grant spending within that area, and some of it has been very justifiable. But what we're avoiding really are the schools that may be not thinking particularly about some of the roles of the staff within their school if they're being identified within the plan. And the easiest one to pick up on is the teaching assistants. A generic teaching assistant through the Sutton Trust shows it has very little impact. However, a teaching assistant that is running an intervention programme, focusing on developing very early literacy skills with our youngest learners, developing on reading skills, numeracy skills with our students right across the age phase, has quality impact. So we're trying to encourage our schools to code their grant plan appropriately, and that will give them measurable outputs to show the impact of their grant expenditure. Just 3 areas I'd like to pick up on really. This is new development for our region. One piece of work has been based on the Spirals of Inquiry. It's been led by Professor David Egan and James. And that's very much, we've worked with our leading network schools, focusing on what happens to our FSM learners. So the schools have all used the Spirals of Inquiry approach and looked at a small group of their learners and seen either when the gap starts to appear, the influences an FSM learner may struggle with. Why aren't they as resilient as a non-FSM learner? Where does that start to happen? In order to ensure that they're directing an intervention appropriately through their grant plan. We're now at the stage that this document is being written into a research paper by Professor David Egan, and we're due to share that with schools by the end of the summer term. And it's important for us to take that leap of faith and to start to develop regional research papers to complement the national and both international papers. The second project is called the RADI project. This is called the Raising the Achievement of Disadvantaged Learners. We have 6 of our high schools across the region, working with the RADI organisation. It's based in the Midlands, and we are working with those schools in partnership with a RADI consultant, and that's literally about raising the achievement of the vulnerable learners, and it's aimed at starting in year 7 in order to start to close that gap. So if that's where the thin edge of the wedge starts in our secondary schools, that's where we need to start to focus the work. And it's about having proportionate representation in all their activities from FSM learners. So we're working with the schools that whatever assessment data they have, they rank non-FSM and they rank their FSM. And if they have 24% of their FSM within their school, you would expect a 24% representation of those FSM learners in the top set if they're set in, access to extracurricular activities, access to enrichment activities. And that's the term we're using with those schools. It's about proportionate representation to ensure that we're raising the aspirations of those FSM learners. And then the third piece of exciting work that we're engaging with, the region has funded all our secondary schools to have a vulnerable learner lead, and they are going to go through a year's professional development programme on developing their leadership skills, how to use those leadership skills, looking at the progress of the vulnerable learners within their school, sharing good practice from around the region and around the nation, so that they become really, really informed practitioners in all our secondary schools, with the hope then of cascading their knowledge within their clusters, because it's not all just on our secondary schools, is it? We have to address vulnerable learners from early years right throughout. So schools that do it well, and we do have schools that do it well, they don't confuse disadvantage with low ability, so it is about that proportionate representation. They really, really forensically track their pupils so that they don't have just a big bag of vulnerable learners, because you could have a vulnerable learner that is free school meal, but actually is on the more talented list of the school as well, and you need to ensure that you're meeting that need as much as the poverty need. It's about using research, and we've already mentioned that, and it's about high quality teaching and learning. Okay? It's about engaging those learners in our classroom so that they feel part of the learning, they feel that they've got the confidence and the resilience to engage in that learning, and they don't see themselves as different learners from those children who are not FSM and not LAC. It's about having designated leads, and those leads being held accountable, but also professionally developing that lead so that they have all the skills and knowledge that they need to fulfill that role. It's about having robust performance, about having the schools that have robust grant plans, and it feeds directly into that school development plan. It's all got to fit, hasn't it? The grant plan actions have got to sit in the school development plan, and then the school self-evaluation has got to report on the impact that that has all had. And it's about involving everybody. The performance of our vulnerable learners is everybody's business. It's not just regional consortia, it's not just our school, it is everybody involved, and everybody needs to be talking about the progress of our vulnerable learners so that everybody has that shared knowledge and understanding of them. And of course, it's about having that clear vision and culture within your school. It's raising the attainment and the aspiration of all our learners. Likewise, we have some schools that don't do it successfully, and the list there will identify some of the outcomes of those schools. So that's everything that I wanted to share with you today. Are there any questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive report there. And it's been very hotly debated, both in full council and here. And it is an issue that we're very concerned about. You go to the floor now then and question. Peter.
Okay, well, thank you for that. A lot of food for thought there. But our concern on this committee is very specifically Monmouthshire, of course, and the gap here. So I want to take you back almost to that slide one and ask, for one of a better way of asking, how real is that gap on the ground as opposed to being I suppose, what you might call a statistical quirk. Yeah. For example, the trends, I know that's partly dealt with in slide 1. I know, you know, it's important not to look at 1 year in isolation. How far are we, when we look at other authorities, and we seem to have a wider gap, how far are we dealing or comparing like with like? For example, do other authorities with a lower gap maybe have more vocational courses, or a curriculum that is more suited to free school meal pupils, or whatever? I mean, I think if we're going to develop a strategy, we need, first of all, to know, you know, how, as I say, how real is that gap, although that's not a perfect way of asking the question, I understand. And if the gap is real, is significant, why is it happening specifically here in Monmouthshire, or why is it wider here in Monmouthshire than in maybe many other areas? Is it to do with the level of grant assistance? Is it even maybe some sort of sociological thing with the demographic makeup of Monmouthshire? I think we need to know these things, you know, to identify the problem specifically here in Monmouthshire before the solutions can be specifically tailored to the situation.
A complex question for which there is no definitive answer. In terms of the gap, if we look over time, foundation phase to Key Stage 4, we would expect that gap to widen if we look at it relative to Wales, if that makes sense. But we wouldn't expect it to be the extent that it is currently in Monmouthshire. When we also look at perhaps similar local authorities, and there is no such thing as a perfect match for Monmouthshire or a perfect match for Blaenau Gwent when we look at similar authorities. But if we say look at a Vale of Glamorgan or a Powys, which are perhaps some of the closest, they do have smaller gaps for their FSM learners than Monmouthshire has done over the last 3 years. So there is definitely something there which needs to be addressed. The extent of it, I can't give you a definitive answer on. When you mention vocational qualifications, when we're looking at that gap, it is currently the level 2 threshold, including English, Welsh, mathematics. The biggest driver of that underperformance is the English and mathematics, particularly the literacy element of underperformance. So it's not about the vocational qualifications per se. That doesn't mean we're don't want to get the right mix of vocational qualifications. So it is driven by the literacy elements, which, when you look at the figures earlier on in children's education foundation phase Key Stage 2, that's overcome earlier on, but it isn't sustained, that improvement into secondary schools, which is what we've got to support our secondary schools to address, which is what the programmes Kath outlined are very much about. We also know that where our secondary schools get it right for their FSM learners, it tends not to be at the expense of other learners. They get it right for all learners when they get it right for their FSM, is the key part. So yes, there is a reality to it. The extent of it, I can't put a definitive answer on.
Can I come back on that? Well, thanks. Those are useful points to make. I'm just wondering, in relation to vocational qualifications, even though you're judging it by literacy and numeracy or maths, is it not possibly the case that schools that provide a total package, which is more suitable to the particular type of pupil, that does improve their performance in maths and English?
Quite possibly, and there is evidence to show that if a learner engagement is an important factor in their education. It brings me on to another point, that this is the last year of the level 2 plus being reported. I've done a workshop on the changes to measures that we're going to face over the coming years from 2019, where we are actually going to move to much broader measures of the CAP 9 points-based measures in literacy, numeracy, science and the Welsh Baccalaureate. We're going to have to carefully unpick those figures to look at free school meal gaps almost from a ground zero of new measures coming in. Welsh Government are publishing a level 2 plus national figure, but there won't be any regional figures published for that for next year as well. So we are going to be measuring a broader base curriculum, but we are going to need to support schools on how to interpret that, because it measures both curriculum and quality at the same time, I would describe it as.
Councillor Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. I have to say the view from back here is much nicer than it is from down the front there. And perhaps it will also allow me to speak a little more freely than perhaps I've been able to at times in the past. I would like to thank you for coming and acknowledge that I think as a committee we realise that the standards in individual schools are not the responsibility of EAS but of the schools themselves, and that the authority itself has a statutory duty about standards in its schools. And I would make the point that I am deeply disappointed that there is no single representative of our own children and young people's director department here this morning. The date of this committee was set months ago, and they have taken themselves away for an internal day. I would wish to place on record that I am very disappointed about that, because I think we're all partners in this. You have outlined your role in that process very effectively. I declared my personal interest at the start of this meeting. I am a governor at King Henry VIII School and have a very specific role on the governing body to be in looking after the interests of our vulnerable people, which obviously includes our free school meal population, looked after children, our young carers, and so on. I am also delighted to say that King Henry is one of two of our four comprehensives in Monmouthshire that has been categorised as green. That leaves two that are not. I'll leave it there. But certainly, I think we need to be able to hold our schools to account, as well as EAS. And I think you're working in partnership with them. I think the union rep here is quite right in saying that we need to be able to hold people to account in Monmouthshire. It is disappointing that on the slide you showed us about your professional grant panel and the reports that head teachers brought to you, that a majority of those reports needed more work doing on them. I think that speaks volumes about Monmouthshire schools. Having said that, I think we need to take care as well, because we have got good professionals in our schools, and I think the fact that for the very first time we have two green-rated comprehensives shows the work that is going on in Monmouthshire, and the fact that standards are rising from the point when, as a county, we were in special measures. I think we've moved a long way from that. And certainly, I think that you have done a lot to help schools pull their data together. So they're in a position now when they can actually address individual needs of pupils. And it's been a long time since any professional in Monmouthshire has said to me, well, these are the results from this or that group. They're not very good, but almost hinting, well, what could you expect from that group? It's like going to the doctor and being told, well, I could fix you, but it's your fault that you're ill. You would never expect that from other professionals. And I think it is unacceptable for schools to expect anything less than excellence from every child that they teach. Now, I'm getting round to my question. You mentioned Professor Egan's study, and I was part of the team that asked for that to be done at EAS. I think that one of the things that's come out that you haven't alluded to this morning, so I'd like your opinion on it, is this almost subliminal use of language by teachers at Key Stage 4 when the language of teaching, because of the nature of the curriculum, is getting more complex. And I wonder if this is almost part of why Monmouthshire over time has done very, very well at foundation stage, and it tails off so that our key stage 4 outcomes do not sustain the progress right through to the end that was shown when the children come in at the age of 4. And whether Professor Egan is ever going to be able to actually be able to rationalise why, and then you can work with schools to address it. This issue about the language of teachers and the language of teaching. Because you've mentioned literacy and numeracy. By the time you're 16, you should be able to compute quite effectively. You should be able to read and write quite effectively. And it is schools' jobs to make sure that that happens, even when children come from disadvantaged backgrounds. Professor Egan was beginning to unravel the suggestion that the language of teaching and the language of study is almost too much of a challenge for some of our youngsters who are disadvantaged. Now, if that is the case, we're going to need to start thinking very deeply about how we get through to these youngsters to enable them to unlock their potential. Now, this is probably far too much for an individual school. It is the responsibility of EAS, and Professor Egan's work, I think, is a super first step. But if he's right in saying it's the language of teachers and the language of teaching which is a challenge to disadvantaged children in many cases, then how are those children ever going to break through the success barrier without some sort of input from EAS to enable schools to address that almost subliminal difficulty?
Can I just make a general point? I mean, Tim, it is more questions now, and I think, if we're going into very long sort of conversations, I don't think we're going to get through it. But obviously, let you answer now the David Egan issue.
I'll start to address the points towards the end about the language of teaching. I think it is, not diminishing his work whatsoever, I think it is about multiple factors that influence our disadvantaged learners. It's not just one thing. It's not necessarily the language of instruction. It may be a component, and we're more than happy as an organisation to engage with that and look at that further. There are other external factors from research points to from the age of about 8 where peer influences come in. Primary schools actually do a very good job of supporting the learner to stay focused on their education, to diminish the influence of those external factors. When schools then move into secondary settings, those external factors are harder to protect from, if that makes sense, for some of our socioeconomic factors. I would refer, Kath may want to add on to this, and I flicked the slide up there earlier. I think we've got to focus on the schools that do it well, and that key component. Do not confuse disadvantage with low ability, and make sure we retain those high expectations for those learners. And that's what some of the programs like the RADI program do, where you have mechanisms to raise expectations, or certainly not adversely diminish them. I don't know if Kath wants to add any more onto that.
I would go back to the RADI principle, actually, that there's proportional representation in all areas of the school for your vulnerable learners. And it is not assuming that children who are potentially living in poverty are low ability learners. You just got to find their interest, hook their learning, and provide the scaffolding that they need to perform against their peers who are not free school meal children, down to the point that some of our high schools are now using their grant to ensure that all their Year 7 free school meal children have the equipment on day 1 to start a high school life. Because their findings has been, they turn up to their first maths lesson, you've got to have your own calculator. They don't have a calculator. And also making sure that they have the same enrichment opportunities. And it's not all about your children going skiing, is it? It's about your children all your children having those real life, rich experiences of things within their locality. For example, we've got a lovely project going on in a primary school actually within the region with very high level of FSM. Don't do a year trip with their foundation phase anymore. It's now a family trip where they use public transport because through their evaluation of last year, they took the children on the train to the beach and they then found out that during the summer holidays, their most vulnerable families copied that and they went on the same train to because it had been role modelled to them by the school. And that's a real specific example, but it's about sharing those examples with our high schools and for them being brave enough at looking at those creative opportunities to ensure they're engaging with them.
Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I noticed on your slides about schools that do it well, but I was just wondering whether or not, you know, it starts with do not confuse disadvantage with low ability. And I just wondered whether a sort of a more positive message could be put forward, because I think looking at the Sutton research and things like that, it says that basically, in very simple terms, it's not the Tesco every little bit counts or something. It's actually every child counts, and it's a whole school philosophy, which is basically expecting every child to reach a high level of attainment. And I wondered whether or not it would be worthwhile looking at sort of, you know, obviously, and key to this is the leadership team, whether it's possible for the leadership team, in a sense, to have specific training in relation to schools that do well. And I was thinking about the other authority I was a councillor in, and there was one school in Crewe, and it was a Roman Catholic school, and it took children from, it had a very high English as a second language area, and it was in quite a deprived area as well. And their attainment in terms of their examinations was really, really good, but I think it was based on the philosophy that every child counts. And also, I think the Sutton research shows that the faith schools do very well. And we don't have a particular faith school in our secondary schools. That's one question. I'm sorry, I've got a few. I tend to cover a number. The second question is about Key Stage 4, because that seems to be the area that we have the biggest gap, and yet your grant seems to concentrate on the Key Stage 3, I think, 60% of the grant. And I wondered whether there ought to be some discretion in terms of, the schools putting where the need actually is. The third point was really about how the fact that we've got a secondary school that does better in the FSM gap, but then their attainment level isn't as high as some of the other schools. So obviously you've got to make sure that's not a factor that covers things. And the fourth question is about double deprivation, in a sense, because we've got pockets of deprivation. We haven't got the cumulative sums that some other areas have in pupil development grant. And so, it's more difficult with the resources that we've got to actually achieve what we want to achieve. Whether or not the Welsh Government could support areas where there are double disadvantage in the sense of pockets of deprivation by extra grants, and whether it's something that you could look at. I mean, I was thinking particularly of, we had a talk about, and the fifth question, if you can remember all of these, because I don't think I can, is basically we had a wonderful talk from a lady who in Monmouthshire is involved in Flying Start, and she was showing how basically they monitored the work and how it affected primary level sort of things. And I was wondering whether, there ought to be sort of like a booster type of start and support for secondary schools as well, you know, because that assisted in other areas.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there, Louise, because you know, we've got multi-questions there. I'm beginning to struggle to remember them. Shall we deal with those? And can we go more to direct questions now rather than thoughts about various things? And I don't want to stop dialogue and discussion, but I think let's pinpoint on questions now. So let the AS answer these, and then I'll go to Councillor Maureen Powell.
I think you made a very important point at the beginning, that it is about positivity in our schools, was the key point before questions. That's the absolute key. And that do not confuse disadvantage with low ability is intended to be a very positive statement, and that's the philosophy that we take with working with our schools. I think your first question was on faith schools. We wouldn't really have an opinion on that. The data is available for itself. The second question was on PDG grant and 60% of that FSM in Key Stage, 60% in Key Stage 3. That's a terms and conditions of the Welsh Government grant, which we are bound to, so we stick to that. The double deprivation question, Welsh Government have their formula for deprivation, and again, it will be for them to determine whether they wish to change policy to offer grants in other ways, rather than us determining that. I don't know, Kath, whether you want to add anything.
Just to say, really, that the educational journey of a vulnerable learner doesn't happen overnight with whatever money is thrown at it or intervention. It's a long-term plan, and that's very much about early intervention. And we're not going to fix this overnight, but by ensuring that our schools are providing excellent leadership, excellent classroom teaching and learning, and real detailed tracking systems to ensure nobody falls through the net, and the performance of our vulnerable learners being everybody's business, they will make that progress over time. And it's important for us to support our schools not to just use hard data to report that performance, but actually it is the measures of progress that that learner makes over time that is also as equally as important to report on. i.e. the child coming to school every day, are they avoiding any form of exclusions? Are they accessing all the additional enrichment activities? And to get that pupil voice, there's an awful lot for schools to report on, not just their end results.
Go to Councillor Powell now, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Is there any mileage, do you think, in having some sort of meeting, either within school time or out of school time, with parents? I think the worst vulnerable time is they're coming up to Key Stage 4. They've got to that age when they're probably, those that are keen to go academically know where they're going, but there are a lot of other children who don't know quite where they're going, and they just need some encouragement, because everybody's got a gift somewhere. And I know of one pupil in particular couldn't get into his sixth form because he couldn't get his maths. He took it 3 or 4 times and never got it. But he was sent to a college where he found his niche, and he's just had a degree in sports science. So it's just a case of directing. But I don't know whether there's any way. I know the teachers have all their information there, and they do it individually, because I see this as a governor. But it's just whether there's any way that they could get a meeting with the parents as well, to get that encouragement behind them, because that's what I think they're lacking a lot of the time. It's just they've got to that stage where they think, oh, good, I can leave school and I'm gone.
Absolutely.
But is there possibility of something like that happening?
We're working with schools on 2 factors. Number 1 is to have earlier career advice for their learners. Years 10 and 11's too late. You know, some of the children, and if you go around listening to the learners, actually free school meal children have huge aspirations of the jobs they want to do. They don't know the pathways they need to follow to get there. And so we're desperately working with the high schools to encourage that early career advice, more or less right from year 7. And the other area that you've nicely picked up is actually for the secondary schools to work with their primary schools on attendance of parental attendance at various events, whether that is options evening, parental consultations. We're working with schools where parents' attendance when they were in primary school was 100% attendance at those events. Come to year 7 and it's already gone to 60% and it falls to 40% in year 11. Those families need to continue the educational journey with their children, and schools need to go the extra mile to ensure that, 1, they're engaging with them, 2, they're not putting up any barriers, so those parents, and very often they've had negative experiences in school, will come to those events so that they are educated and they are informed about that learner's pathway as well.
Thank you.
Mike Fowler.
Hi, I'm just coming back to a Monmouthshire perspective now, and I look at Monmouthshire statistically compared to the other authorities within the EAS region, and I look at our very low FSM numbers. So looking at in the whole of Key Stage 4 in Monmouthshire, we've only got 85 children. I mean, that's across our four secondaries, and that's obviously split between the 2 school years. Similarly, at Key Stage 2, we've got 100 kids, and that's split across 31 schools, across 4 classes in each school. So our FSM populations in each school are very low. Contrast that to, say, at schools in Blaenau Gwent, it's a very different picture. And also the funding that Monmouthshire schools get for PDG is equally low. So we don't have a critical mass of funding to put into interventions and stuff. So I wonder how EAS is operating differently in Monmouthshire to support our schools and support our FSM learners compared to our other partners in the EAS region, like, say, Blaenau Gwent, who have the money and have momentum of funding to be able to do more initiatives. I wonder how, on a school level, we're being supported with the limited funds and the limited children. When you consider, say, in a class in primary, you might have 1 child, and it's very dangerous to single out that 1 child. I just wonder what, as an organisation, you're doing for Monmouthshire.
Just to clarify the point that those grant terms, conditions and allocations and formulas are Welsh Government determined, to clarify before Kath moves on to support.
It's right that we support all schools in whatever situation they are in, whether they've got low FSM numbers or high FSM numbers. And it is about developing that school-to-school work. It is about identifying the good practice and ensuring that we're partnering at a school that's doing it well with a school that is on a journey with doing it well. And that's one of the luxuries, really, of working across 5 authorities across the region, is that we've got that specialism somewhere within the region, and we've got a bigger bag to match people with. And so we are really, really encouraging school-to-school work, networking. As I said, the vulnerable leads, but that's from every secondary school, will go through the professional learning programme. And with regards to the finance, that was one of the notions, really, with the LAC cluster grant, was that you could do more with a bigger pot of money on a cluster basis for to meet the needs of your LAC and adopted children than if schools were giving out smaller amounts. So I don't know if I've directly answered that question, but just to reassure you that we are supporting all schools.
I mean, there's a lot of information in there about the wellbeing and equity programme, and it's clearly important, and you automatically think that, you know, increases in focus on wellbeing and equity will bring better outcomes for FSM children, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence for that. I want to understand and pick that a bit in terms of the link between increasing wellbeing and focusing on wellbeing and the improvements in outcomes for FSM children. Just want to get your view on that.
Sorry. If you have the strategy, then it unpicks that it's involved in looking at the learning environment, making sure the learning environment for all our learners is welcoming to the child and the family. It's about ensuring that the teaching and learning in the classroom is accessible to all those children. It's about looking and addressing the barriers of learning, and that's very school specific. What is there that is preventing your most vulnerable learners progressing and doing well? And that's very much the role of the wellbeing audit tool for schools to conduct that, because that does give your own personal picture of your school. And although we invite peers to come and participate in that activity, that is very, very school specific to really unpick why aren't they engaging and accessing everything on a like basis.
Sorry. Can you also just, you talked about ACEs and you've talked about the wellbeing strategy. How does the Thrive and Evolve programmes that I know, certainly in the school that I'm involved with, we are training in and starting to use and starting to focus on, how does that all fit in with this strategy?
Okay. So we're working in partnership with the ACE Hub from Bridgend. There's 3 units of work, really, professional learning opportunities that have come out of the ACE Hub. Unit 1 is the ACE Awareness, which is a 2.5 to 3 hour session. And we've got 17 schools across the region now who are yet to receive that. All the others have received that. That's followed by Unit 2, the training programme, and that very much features on the skills of your staff, developing motion coaching techniques, developing safe places in your school, and looking at what else can you do to support your learner. And that's very much where we encourage schools to share what other programmes they're engaged with. We wouldn't necessarily say you go with one. So we have got schools who are engaging with Thrive, with ELSA, with nurture groups, with direct emotion coaching. Well, again, it goes back to whatever suits your school needs. And it's right that we have a variety of programmes across our school. Then, as a consortia, we put a tender out this time last year, and New Pathways charity, which is based in Newport and Cardiff, were awarded that tender. They're writing a professional learning programme so it will consist of 5 training modules for all staff in a school. So it's a train the trainer model, but that's exactly how we've addressed the ACE Awareness. And those 5 units of work really are delivered during staff meetings. It looks at the emotional needs of learners, the barriers of learning to those learners, linking into mental health, and that's very much where we've been working with each local authority, because some local authorities offer mental health first aid and other various mental health programmes. It's also where we're looking at working with other charities. So we encourage schools to work with Save the Children, with Barnardo's. Again, I'm going back to that statement, it's everybody's business, and we try and encourage schools to look at what's out there and to make sure they're doing what's right for their school, not jumping on the bandwagon because every school's doing Thrive, and likewise not every school can afford to do Thrive. There are other options out there, and it's about us supporting them to look at those options, go and visit schools that are implementing them, and then making that choice that's appropriate for their school's needs.
Thanks. Can I go to Councillor Joe Watkins? And I think it's a brief question from Peter, but time is marching on, and obviously you've got another presentation and a set of questions. You want to obviously look at the new curriculum.
Thank you. Just one of 2 questions. One of them I think is going to be quite brief, because I think you've said it sideways. In terms of the LAC cluster grants, is that for just currently looked after children, or does it actually include the adopted population, which I know we actually have more of, well, a reasonably sizable amount in Monmouthshire, because that's the sort of demographic of the county, because I sit on various adoption groups and parents are regularly saying that their adopted children are not necessarily getting the emotional support they need, because obviously many of them have had a traumatic early start to their lives. So will some of that funding also be going through to supporting those adopted children? And the second one was slide 20. And in terms of the confusing language that teachers use, could you please explain metacognition and self-regulation? Because you've highlighted it as green, as in something that should be being done. And I consider myself reasonably well educated. I don't know what that means.
Okay. If I pick up first the question about the looked after and the known adopted, all the guidance and the reference that we provide to schools is that that grant supports those children who are looked after. And of course, that's got to be unpicked, because as an LA, you can be a corporate parent to a looked after child in your LA. You can be a corporate parent who looked after children in another Wales LA. And you can be a corporate parent to a learner who's actually being educated in England. So we have to ensure there's equity of wherever that looked after learner is. But all our guidance and documentation does reference known adopted children. and it's supporting schools. And again, primary schools are good at this, but that's because perhaps it's easier to develop that relationship. You do that initial induction meeting with the parent. Number one, ensuring that that information is shared if it's agreed by the family from primary to secondary, but equally secondary schools having the opportunities within their systems so that a parent can come forward and openly say, my child is adopted. Research would show that very often it is shown when something's going wrong at Key Stage 4. Oh, and they're adopted. You know, that is the information that you need when they start a secondary school. So with regards to reference of metacognition and self-regulation, that's all about really the learning to learn agenda. What does a good learner look like? How does a good learner behave? How does a good learner revise? How does a good learner ask what they don't know? How does a good teacher give quality feedback to that learner to give them the next steps? And how does that learner know what to do about those following and those recommendations? And the self-regulation is about managing yourself, knowing your own learning style. I'm a very, very kinesthetic learner. Everything's got to be highlighted, post-its, etc. I get that I'm probably sitting next to James, who is the very extreme opposite. But it's important as well for the teachers to develop whatever style of learning that the children have in their classroom to meet their needs. And for a child who is kinesthetic, who may be learning something by rote, to actually self-regulate themselves, that they can access that, manage their behaviours and their engagement in the learning, knowing that's not their preference to their learning style.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, because I ran a program around metacognition at WJC a few years ago. The classic definition of metacognition is thinking about thinking. And the reason why it became has become quite in vogue. Oh, crumbs. Sorry. Yeah, that's the reason why it's become quite in vogue is because of this drive towards PISA and the fact of pupils' ability to problem solve through PISA. So what metacognition, if well developed in the classroom, allows a learner to do is to think, where have I seen a problem like this before? How can I approach it? What strategies have I got in my bag of strategies that I can use to approach this question? And then therefore, how can I break it down and solve it? Okay, so the metacognition would be their ability to reflect and think about what they've done in order to address and solve some of those sort of challenges and problems. And the reason why it's the top of the Sutton Trust is obviously once you've got the ability to do that and self-regulate, then in any situation you're put into in terms of exams, tests, if you're working in teams, you're able to solve those problems. So it's an absolutely key strategy that can be developed really effectively in classrooms through effective questioning, opportunities to develop problem solving, as Kath was saying, looking at feedback and so on.
Ed's saying this is your
sorry.
Okay. Right.
Could you tell?
Yeah.
Stop it now.
I know what cognition is now. I don't think I've got it, but I know what it is. Okay. Very briefly now, Peter, sorry.
Yeah, quickly as I can. Picking up on the point about the situation of one FSM pupil in a classroom being a problem for that pupil, I'm just wondering actually whether the problem might be the opposite, in that whereas in primary schools, that pupil will be in a mixed ability situation normally, and in primary schools there doesn't seem to be such a problem. In secondary schools, unless you're very careful, they're more likely to be setted or streamed, and FSM pupils could easily end up in horrible language, bottom sets or lower sets or whatever, but there's a disproportionate number of them, perhaps together, and again, unless you're very careful, you know, that's where we get problems with aspiration and pupil engagement and so on. I wonder if Professor Egan's research is looking at all at that, and if it's not, should it?
Okay, thank you for that. And totally agree, and it goes back to that proportional representation, and where there's one in the school, that's a huge more challenge. I would also add as well that that's probably one learner that is entitled to access free school meals, but I bet they're surrounded by 5 people who are very much on that borderline, and that respect needs to be paid to those as well. They might not qualify for that grant, but my word, they need all that intervention and additional support. David Egan's programme, he's worked with 6 various schools, and each school has taken a different foci on it. So, for example, one school has particularly just looked at 6 girl FSM learners because they're feeling that that's a piece of work they need to improve. And they've literally taken, they're currently in their high school, they've mapped them right back to primary school. Did they have access to Flying Start? Did they go to nursery? Were they engaged in family engagement programs very early on to develop that rich language that the families need? And therefore, their findings are now changing the picture of the intervention they need to put in place for those 6 girls in that particular year group. And it's not just their findings, it's the process they've gone through to identify and get them to a place where they know they need to change something they're doing within their school. And it's about us training and educating the other schools to go through that process. So even if it is that one learner, let's go back, let's get that learner's voice as well, because the chances are that that learner probably can identify that they may be different or deemed different from other learners. Tracking back, where did that start? What does that learner want? You know, that one learner may want to be in the football team. Well, come on, that's an easy thing to solve. So it's actually training our schools in the process they need to go through to provide the best opportunities for the vulnerable learners.
Very briefly now.
Yeah, just a very follow-up. I mean, I didn't get an answer to the question about leadership training, you know, by taking a school that was doing, a secondary school that was doing very well and explaining how they were doing very well for every pupil. And the second point, you know, the slides have been very useful, but some of the mnemonics I've had difficulty with. I mean, I thought that LAC was local authority cluster, and now I've found it's looked after children. You know, so if it's presented again, please could
learn
you
something every day,
do those, you know, I was just taking a guess at those, but obviously the short terms are very familiar with you, but not necessarily with us. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, we do that with leaders. No, in question,
Yes.
with getting schools to work together, yes, we do that as
And
part
it's
of the
built
programmes.
into the leadership programme that we're running out now for all vulnerable leads. We've got schools that are doing it well, sharing it, their practice and what they've done.
And the point about mnemonics, we'll make sure they're in full first time next time. All 200 of them.
Well, draw to a close then, as I say, looking at the clock and in terms of the next presentation. But, you know, thank you very much wholeheartedly, you know, from myself and from the committee for the presentation and answering some very difficult questions. And I think it's been very useful. You know, the one thing I would say is, obviously, it's answered questions, and in many ways, I think we as a committee are reassured in terms of, you know, what you're doing. But in reality, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. It comes out in the results. And obviously, next year, the whole council and this committee will obviously be looking at results. I think as well, it's a two-pronged movement in the sense, and I think it's a good point that Councillor Grocott made. I think in that sense, we must hold schools to account because they are the ones who are responsible for teaching and learning within their institutions. And however much advice and strategies, etc., come down to them from EAS, it's what actually happens in the management room and particularly in the class and in terms of attitude. So my suggestion would be that we ask some of the schools who perhaps are not in green to actually come in and we have a question and answer session and we look at, you know, their individual results really, and possibly perhaps bringing in a green school that is obviously doing well. I think as well, we need to look at other authorities. You mentioned Vale Glamorgan. You know, if you look at other authorities across Wales, like Ceredigion, etc., they must have very similar issues in terms of rurality, etc., and low numbers of FSM children. And undoubtedly, it's lessened, but there is still a stigma of being on free school meals when you're in a class in one of the comprehensives in Monmouthshire with some very, very affluent children who are perhaps saying, well, I'm not going on the America trip, I've been twice already. whereas some of those FSM children haven't been elsewhere. Key things, I think, is working together, certainly the local authority, and I note Councillor Groco's points that I will pass on to Will McLean, the EAS, and obviously, importantly, the schools. And at the end of the day, results are there writ large, aren't they? We can't escape them, and the media can't escape them. But thank you very much for all your efforts this morning. Diolch yn fawr. We'll move on now. It's 11:30. We're going to move on now to the agenda item 7. And this is presentation on the new school curriculum. And James Kent, who is the curriculum reform lead for EAS, is going to take us through the slide presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. So I was here last year, I think, when we talked a lot about the detail of the curriculum. So what I was asked to do this time is to come back and reflect on the extent to which the new curriculum would address some of the skills gaps in South East Wales, okay, as a particular focus for this work. So a bit of future gazing in terms of where we are now and where we're likely to be as we move forward. What I would start by saying is, though, let's have a look at the timescales. The draft curriculum, you may be aware, was published on the 30th of April. The feedback window now lasts until the 19th of July. So we've had a series of engagement events across the region a couple of weeks ago. We did 16 events. We've got some more coming up after half term to get everyone's views around the new curriculum in terms of what's in there, the content, the detail, and so on and so forth. So there's the opportunity until July to provide that feedback. What will then happen is that will be written up, and the final publication of the curriculum will come to us in January of 2020. Okay. When I say final, it's really important to point out that the new curriculum will form part of what we're calling statutory guidance for schools. So there will be a degree of flexibility, what Graham Donaldson has termed as well subsidiarity, in terms of how schools interpret that back for within individual schools. And the new curriculum obviously won't become part of the statutory landscape until 2022. So we've got a sort of 3-year transition until we get to that point. And it's also worth pointing out, in thinking about this and what impact this curriculum will have as we move forward, that the learners that are going to be affected by this curricular change, and therefore the changes that will come to qualifications, which I'll also pick up later on, are currently in year 3. So they're unlikely to be entering the workforce until the earliest at 2027, let's say for a graduate pathway, up until 2032. So quite a long way into the future till we see the real impact of these changes as we move forward. That's quite a lot of numeracy in order to calculate all of that. So I think, again, we talked a little bit about the rationale for change last time in terms of PISA, but actually there are significant reasons why the curriculum is changing. As Graham Donaldson set out in Successful Futures, in 1988, the curriculum today has the same features it had largely in 1988, organised by subject, organised by skills and range, less specified now perhaps than it was in 1988, but still very much the same structure. And actually, the world has been transformed in that time through globalisation, and we need to think differently about what needs to be in the curriculum and how we prepare our young people for the world of work. That was backed up by the CBI, who, in that quote on the slide, said systemic change is needed to align the curriculum, examinations and accountability framework with the outcomes we're looking for. So what is the CBI looking for? What are we looking for in terms of our future workforce? So when the CBI was doing supporting in England the development of the new national curriculum back in the early part of the 2010s, here are the kind of skills that they were saying we need from our future workforce. Okay, and actually these are the same sorts of things that when Graham Donaldson was going around Wales doing his summary for Successful Futures, we were saying the same things. We need to be creative, communicate well, be literate and numerate, solve problems, work together in teams. This is perhaps a different one, have a global perspective in terms of their understanding, show initiative, work independently and be a lifelong learner. None of which we disagree, but all of which are traditionally quite difficult to assess in the formal part of education. Hence why, as we change the curriculum, we also need to think about the way that qualifications change, and I'll come to that as we move forward. So how is the curriculum for Wales different? How will it address those areas better than perhaps the existing curriculum that we've got now? Well, this curriculum is purposes driven. So it's driven, as you know, by the 4 purposes. that were set out by Graham Donaldson, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail in a minute. And what we're working with schools on in thinking about is actually those 4 purposes are the starting point for the planning of your curriculum. Previously, subjects or skills have been the starting point for the planning of the curriculum. And what's tended to happen, therefore, is curriculum has become quite fragmented and disjointed. And what we're saying is, let's start with the why. Why are we doing this? Okay, rather than thinking about the what and the how. Okay, so that's a different way of thinking about the way we develop our curriculum. And in terms of the subject content, how can we make more authentic and understandable links across areas of learning, okay, in the subjects that we currently teach? Because quite often, this is done quite well in primary schools in terms of the way that topics and themes are developed through learning, less well in secondary schools, where actually students in one subject can be learning about something, and in another subject they can be learning about the very same thing. Neither of the teachers are aware of this, but the pupils are, okay, and it's how we think about it, how we sequence that, how we make better links and connections across the curriculum, not to dumb the curriculum down, if anything, to really deepen the level of understanding that our young people have. So that's a difference in the way this curriculum has been structured and organised. And I think that the 4th point is crucial. We talked earlier about the philosophy of the foundation phase, and then we've also got GCSEs at the end. Between those 2, we then have currently a Key Stage 2 and 3. There is no continuum of learning. There is no common method of assessment, common approaches to teaching and learning, common approaches to curriculum planning, very little cross-cluster planning in terms of the curriculum, or 3 to 16 planning. What this curriculum will allow us to do is to do that real genuine join-up in terms of some of that planning. And we've got time to do it. We've got a 3-year period until the curriculum becomes part of the landscape, and then obviously a number of years to really develop and refine those approaches. But there is still a strong focus around the development of those core skills of literacy, numeracy and digital competence. Whilst the frameworks will be slightly altered and will form part of statutory guidance, they will still underpin the new curriculum for Wales. And actually, when we start looking at the 4 purposes, and it's really dangerous, the thing that I quite often see when I'm on social media is schools putting #AmbitiousCapableLearners, which is an easy thing to do on Twitter because you've got a limited number of characters. But the danger of that is you don't get into the detail of the points that sit underneath it. Okay, and actually these are really important, because when we looked at that list from the CBI and we thought about the future workforce, a lot of the key messages are conveyed through the 4 purposes. So building up a body of knowledge and skills to connect and apply to knowledge in different contexts, so how we use it, our questioning and enjoying solving problems. Okay, we learned earlier about the importance of problem solving. Can use number effectively in a variety of contexts, not just in the context of mathematics and numeracy. So actually those 4 purposes, if we look at the example then from enterprising creative contributors, okay, this ability to lead and play different roles in teams effectively. We saw earlier about the importance of teamwork in terms of what business is looking for from the curriculum as well, and giving their energy and skills so that other people benefit. Okay, so what is the purpose of school? What is the purpose of learning? That's framed within these 4 purposes, and they should be the starting point for planning for the curriculum, not the subjects within themselves. Okay, and that is a significant shift, I think, in terms of the way we think about this curriculum. There are also some new areas of content. Okay, I've highlighted the ones in red, and that's largely because they are new or significant. Film and digital media. Now, film and digital media is a growing part of the Welsh economy, particularly, and that has been reflected in the fact now that's going to be part of the expressive arts area of learning. Kath's already spoken a lot about well-being this morning. The area of health and well-being is now a significant proportion of the curriculum. Previously, this was wrapped up in areas like RSE, PE, and so on, fairly disjointed and fragmented, and PSE. Now we've got a focused area of learning that looks at the full range of health and well-being issues. And as we'll see as we come to some of the later slides, there's a significant growth in employment in this area across the region as well. And within science and technology, we know that the STEM agenda is really important. So now reflecting the curriculum are engineering and computer science. Okay, so a growth in some of those areas as well. In terms of current skills gap then, so what I did then is looked at some sources of information around, well, where are the skills gaps in South East Wales? So, and of course this data relies on companies completing surveys and returning them. They're not comprehensive, but these are the kind of the key things that I pulled out from that research. In terms of the current skills gap, ICT digital literacy is still a big problem in the future workforce and the current workforce in trying to employ people. Literacy and numeracy, we've mentioned that several times today. Leadership and management, some of the soft skills around communication and customer service, that regularly comes up in surveys of employers, so those soft skills. Welsh language skills, particularly in South East Wales, and specialist subject knowledge within areas of particular employment. So those are the skills gap that are identified by the LSKIP survey. The desirable skills, the skills in demand currently, specialist skills within sectors, and we'll come to them at some of those sectors shortly. Knowledge of how organisations work, solving of complex problems, and their people and personal skills, ability to manage their own time and prioritise their own tasks, customer handling skills and team working. So things that rely on the development of effective relationships, team working and so on. Okay? And again, things that I think, if you look at the way the new curriculum is structured, come through much more clearly in the way that it is intended to be developed within schools. Okay? And obviously there's that difference between the intended curriculum, in terms of the documentation and the principles, and the enacted curriculum that will eventually emerge in schools, and we'll come to some of those challenges as well. So in terms of skills growth in South East Wales, again, according to LSKIP, 5 current areas in greatest demand. The IT sector, advanced materials and manufacturing, financial and professional services, construction, health, social care and education. I think, again, if we look back at that, just the list of the areas of learning, the development of those wider skills, and also the development of those 4 purposes, the new curriculum will better serve that potential future employment body than the existing curriculum. So if we look at some comparisons, and this is quite crude, but you'll get the idea. In terms of the IT sector, particularly around software development and areas such as that, the focus now around computer science is going to help us to develop our skills in that area. In terms of the advanced materials manufacturing, there is a much greater focus around STEM, engineering, design, technology in the new curriculum, I think, than there was in the previous iteration. With financial and professional services, the way that maths is changing isn't maths itself. Maths doesn't change, by and large. Does it, Ed?
I'm panicking when you said maths changing.
But what is changing is the way we're looking at maths, looking at progression in maths and the way that we teach maths. So the focus is going to be around what we're calling the mathematical proficiencies. And what that should do is it should deepen pupils' understanding of mathematics. So actually they get a much better grasp when they go out into the world of employment. But aligned to that as well in terms of financial and professional services, the focus around wider skills, critical thinking and problem solving, planning and organisation, personal effectiveness, which haven't been part of the mainstream curriculum up until Key Stage 4. That should also assist in terms of the development of those skills. And then, as I said, I mentioned health and social care, a much bigger focus around health and well-being. But obviously, then aligned to that, the development of qualifications, and we've talked about vocational qualifications this morning, that have value, utility to young people so that they can go forward into those future workforces. In terms of future employment in South East Wales, this was from Careers Wales, and I appreciate this is 2024, and we've said that those young people won't enter the workforce until 2027, the first to have that real focus within the new curriculum. This is based on a 4% projection in growth in employment. You can see there the big area, again, care workers and home carers, significant recruitment would need to be required in that area in terms of service in the future economy. Sales and retail, kitchen catering assistants. It's quite interesting to look at those figures and think about what opportunities there are. But I think there are things that are changing now that our existing young people who are older than that current year 3 may benefit from in terms of some of the qualifications change. So I thought I'd reflect very briefly on that as well. So one of the things that Qualifications Wales are currently doing is they're looking at a number of qualifications linked to some of these areas of need that we've identified. So in terms of construction of the built environment, from September 2021, so in a couple of years, So even existing year sort of 6, 7 pupils will start to benefit from some of these opportunities. There'll be 9 new qualifications, including GCSEs, A-levels and new apprenticeship schemes around construction and built environment, because we know that's a significant area of shortage regionally. December 2018, Qualls Wales announced that there would be new GCSEs and A-levels in digital technology qualifications. There's long been a feeling that they haven't been fit for purpose in terms of providing young people the skills that they need to go into the workforce. So that's encouraging as well. And the nice thing about these Qualifications Wales reviews of Qualls is that they are working with the sector really closely to try and design the Qualls to have the skills that the sector needs. And then you'll be aware there was a review of the Welsh Baccalaureate from the Children and Young People's Committee for Welsh Government, and that's being reviewed. It will remain part of the landscape. Ed mentioned earlier it will still be part of the performance measures as we move forward, but there was a feeling that there was too much assessment, okay, and that there needs to be some tweaks and changes to that. So those will be tweaked and changed, but the emphasis of those in developing those wider skills will still be there very much. And then the next part of the work that Qualifications Wales will be doing is it will be looking to engage with a broad range of stakeholders around future qualifications development. We started this process with Qualifications Wales with our secondary head teachers 2 weeks ago. They're starting to ask a broad set of questions around, if we've got this new curriculum, how do we want to develop our new qualifications to best reflect that continuum of learning? And actually, do we want to assess in the same ways that we've traditionally assessed? Notwithstanding the fact that we need to ensure that those qualifications are robust, that they will allow for pathways into higher education, but also into employment. But actually, can we look at assessing some of those things differently, especially if some of the things that we value aren't always the things that we assess through some of those qualifications? So that's part of that debate and dialogue. There'll be a public consultation from autumn 2019 around future qualifications, and everyone's encouraged to engage with that. So there are some changes that are happening now as part of that. So to conclude then, in terms of to what extent do we think this new curriculum is going to support us in developing those skills for our future workforce? It will provide a focus on purpose and authentic experiences, which I think will hopefully better prepare our young people for the world of employment, and not disadvantage those who are looking for academic pathways into higher education as well. The new content areas that are developed should be supportive areas of employment growth and skills shortages. There will be that continued focus on the literacy, numeracy and digital competence frameworks and wider skills, which should ensure that learners have the range of skills that employers require. However, and it is a big however, this depends upon schools' ability to transition to and enact the new curriculum, because teachers will need new skills, leaders will need new skills in terms of the way they plan for their curriculum, in terms of the way they think about themselves within their roles within schools. That's a significant shift. To do that, there's going to have to be a significant programme of professional learning nationally to do some of that work as well. So I think the new curriculum is really ambitious. I think it does what we need it to do in terms of employment, but also providing learners with a better experience. But there are some real challenges for us there as well. So I'll take questions there.
Okay, James, thank you very much for that very comprehensive run through the new curriculum. Can I make a plea now that we have questions, they're not long statements and diatribes, and really within reason, I think stick to one question per person within reason, because I think we lose a bit of track. Can I go to Councillor Maureen Powell and then Leanne?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. But what my question is, how much has the new curriculum affected the number of vocational courses for the less academically inclined?
So in terms of the way that, because the new curriculum isn't part of the statutory framework until 2022, what Qualifications Wales have decided to do is to wait until the draft curriculum has been published and they've been part of the process of developing the new curriculum. Then they're going to have the national consultation around the development of the qualifications, and then we'll see what the offer is going to be. So we're not at the point yet where we can define how many it will be and for what learners, but very much Phil Blaker, when he spoke to our head teachers at the start of this academic year, said they are absolutely determined to ensure that there are robust, high-quality vocational qualifications across the range of areas of learning where that's possible. So that you've got that commitment. I think it'll take a little bit longer for us to see what they are, but okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
Leanne.
I just wanted to ask about the new qualifications that have been identified, the digital technology qualifications. What's the likelihood, I mean, in terms of we're going to need more teachers, we're going to need to recruit more people. I wanted to understand what your knowledge is of how that, whether that's possible, and also within the budget constraints that our secondary schools have, whether they can actually offer these qualifications to our children in Monmouthshire.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of specifics, it would be very difficult for me to answer the question without looking at the figures. In terms of the skills gap in these areas, and actually that filters into sciences as well, in terms of recruitment, one of the things that we are looking to try to do is to attract existing new employees into teaching through the part-time routes to PGCE, which is going to replace the graduate teacher programme. Now, the initial focus for that is going to be around science, but you can imagine that into areas like computer science, that's going to be really important to have the skills to do this. But I think one of the important thing is as well, we do have a number of ICT and computer science teachers in school. It's about making sure they get the professional learning that they need to do their role. So that's something we'll look at as part of our ongoing planning as well.
The other issue is about how schools within the
curriculum offer
shrink their curriculum offers because of their budget constraints.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah, understood.
Qualifications
Yeah.
sounds wonderful,
Yeah.
but only if the schools can actually offer them.
I quite agree. Quite agree.
Councillor Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. I'm reassured what you said about the Welsh back. I was anxious about its future, and certainly in Abergavenny, it's at the heart of our post-16 curriculum. So thank you for that. But as you've made the presentation, another thing dawned on me, and that is that 2 of our 4 comprehensives sit right on the English border. And for the first time since secondary education became compulsory, we're in a position where the curriculums of England and Wales will be very different beasts. One of our comms, of course, has got an English equivalent half a mile down the road, and already there's a pull of children to the English side of the river in Chepstow. Have you got any evidence as yet, as this thing is developing, that there will be some resistance in those border comprehensives from parents who might still favour a more traditional English-based post Key Stage 3 and 4 curriculum?
Got no evidence at this point, and I'll say what I would reiterate as well is that this curriculum isn't part of the statutory landscape till 2022. Now, I know that schools are making steps towards the new curriculum, but I don't think that will really bite until certainly over the next few years. So I think a bit early to judge in terms of that. But it is a challenge, not just in border schools, in all schools where we have a workforce that have traditionally worked on a very traditional curriculum model. And often people will be in secondary schools subject experts, disciplinary experts, and a move to a curriculum like this is quite challenging and potentially, a little bit frightening in some regards. So there is significant change management program here in terms of taking people with you on that journey. And I suspect some of the anxiety for some parents will be around future qualifications and portability and transferability and that kind of thing. And but interestingly, the curriculum I think in Wales is going to reflect more that of curriculum around the other countries of the Atlantic Rim, and certainly places like New Zealand and so on. And obviously those pupils, their qualifications will get them into universities anywhere internationally. So it's about qualifications Wales working with higher education institutions, working with ourselves, and working with parents in terms of that reassurance around the robustness of those future qualifications. So there are all sorts of issues at play here. But I'm sure through the fullness of time we'll know.
I need to come in a little bit, just thinking that current qualifications in Wales in maintained schools are now all with WJEC, aren't they?
Yeah,
And other boards can't operate. Plus the fact that look at Scotland, where they have a totally different qualification system, where obviously students transfer to England, Wales, you know, etc. David Dovey. Oh. We can hear you.
Ah, that's better. Just a very short one, and it answers to some extent my colleague's question about migration demand across borders. I attended a school, Chepstow School governors meeting last night, and we discussed that particular issue, because we are seeing a drain on what we would expect our normal intake to be at the moment, and it is fairly significant for such a short term of time. That was the only point I wanted to make. I think the change, if it continues, will be manifested in a much shorter period than you might expect. And that is because of the migration of people as well, the big migration of people into Chepstow, and the fact that we're developing the housing estates there, which people from Bristol are well fixed to occupy. So it has all the makings, put it that way. Thank you, Chairman, for letting me speak.
Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Obviously, one of the purposes of the curriculum is sort of ambitious, capable learners, and I can see, you know, developing digital and ICT skills can help in that area. But I was looking at the slide to do with future employment in South East Wales, and obviously more of that is to do with the caring and service industry. So I wondered how there was the match, in a sense. I mean, obviously it depends what you're looking at. I mean, if we were looking at future employment in South East Wales 2024, then we would probably be looking at you know, developing care and nursing qualifications. But in relation to ambitious, capable learners, we're desperately in need of doctors in you know, in the health service in Wales, and the shortage there. So you know, how do you match up these areas in terms of future development? And also, if you look even further ahead, you know, obviously with robotics and so forth, we might actually be looking more globally at our leisure industry than anything else, if we're working less and, you know, some of the tasks are being done by other organisations. I mean, I hope elderly people don't just see a robot every day, but you know, I mean, that is one of the concerns. And Shire Newton Primary School were doing this Young at Heart project, which was basically linking intergenerational between the elderly and the young people. And I think that's quite important, particularly if you're focusing on the care industry. And I'd certainly like schools to develop this altruistic motive that doesn't seem to necessarily figure in some of the slides that have been put forward. Thank you.
I think actually I focused on two of the four purposes, and actually if you look at them as a four, you will see all of those things reflected through. I mean, I pick up the point around doctors and a pathway to medicine, because obviously that's it's traditionally been a very academic one. There should be nothing in terms of this curriculum or the qualifications that will emerge from the new suite of qualifications that come that would prevent any pathway to any form of employment at all. So, you know, that would still be very much, we can't have a curriculum that disadvantages people who want to take a particular route. But I think perhaps what's happened with the existing curriculum is it has favoured that route in terms of qualifications, as opposed to some of the other routes and some of the other areas that we could grow. So there is a tension, but it shouldn't restrict them. And as I said, and in terms of that, the altruism, I completely agree. And I think what this curriculum will allow schools to do is to be more sort of outward looking in terms of doing that community, some of that community stuff as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Mike Fowler.
Not so much of a question. Just having attended James's session 2 weeks ago, I just wonder if James could perhaps give the details to the rest of the committee of where to go and that very quick journey to see all the new curriculum details, because it was a really good presentation, and I feel the members of the committee would be brought up to speed if they knew where to go and find more on there.
Yeah. Okay. So there's two potential sources. So one of the things that we did at the event that Mike attended, which was the governor's session, wasn't it, for the new curriculum? We went through in quite a bit of detail the new framework. If you want to see the curriculum in terms of the detail, if you go to hub.wales and Curriculum for Wales 2022, that would take you to the full curriculum framework. And there's a Have Your Say button there, and the Have Your Say button will give you the opportunity to provide feedback, and that's for any sort of stakeholder across Wales to have your say, to provide that. But also, one of the things that we did do at those sessions and the head teacher sessions was we filmed myself and my colleague presenting the new curriculum and some of the key areas around the new curriculum, and that should be available after half term for anyone who's interested. So we can share those links with you as well, okay? And you can look at it at your leisure, if you can bear to listen to me again.
Thanks, James. Any other questions or comments? David, could I just ask you to turn your microphone off, please? Mic's on. All right. Peter.
Yeah, can I just ask how you're going to monitor the workload issues on this? Because there is deep concern already that teachers are drowning under the weight of workload. There are people leaving the profession because of this. And while this is, much better, I think, than when the national curriculum was introduced in the 80s, I had the misfortune of being a head of department at the time, and we wasted a huge amount of time trying to fit good teaching into the national curriculum, rather than the national curriculum fitting the good teaching. I'm worried that's going to happen again. And for this to be a success, you really have to carry the teachers with you, and that won't happen unless the workload issues are dealt with.
Yeah, and this is quite a complex one, because actually sometimes some of that workload is focused around the accountability agenda and what teachers are being asked to do in terms of generating lots of evidence for lots of different approaches to assessment. And one thing that's really clear around the development of this new curriculum is accountability needs to change, because actually what it needs to do is it needs to give schools the space and the time to develop this curriculum. Not that schools aren't accountable, they'll always be accountable, but need them to be accountable to the right thing, which is designing a really effective and engaging curriculum for the young people, and a really good quality of classroom practice, rather than churning out masses and masses and masses of evidence for an external audience. The purpose of assessment is formative. It's for the young person, isn't it, in terms of moving them forward. So I think we have to look at future accountability to support that, to be supportive of the profession, professional learning to support them. And the other thing is collaboration. In my conversations with a number of teachers and senior leaders who I've talked to over the last few weeks, what's becoming clear is their concerns around them trying to do this by themselves, because that's quite daunting. With a totally new framework and a totally new approach, how can we, as an EAS, for example, support groups of teachers working together to make sense of this and to do some of that planning collaboratively, so to try and reduce some of that burden around workload and understanding. So that's kind of the two things I think we need to really look at: professional learning and those changes to the accountability framework to really provide that space for people to be creative.
Okay, thanks, James. Leanne.
And the other thing along with that as well is in emphasising the development of this new curriculum, which is not due to be statutory until 2022, is not to forget that teachers still need to be in front of the cohorts that are there at the moment, so they can't be out of the school all the time learning when there's a balance to be struck between the two things.
Yeah, I completely concur. You'll be aware of two things. Firstly, there's the consultation that was recently completed around an additional inset day for schools, focused specifically around a programme for the new curriculum. So that's something that obviously people will respond to, and we'll find out whether that's been accepted. And you're absolutely right. What we need to do with professional learning is make sure that it's accessible in not just face-to-face formats, so that's sometimes important, but actually digitally and collaboratively online and so on, so that actually if people want to engage and perhaps don't have the time and the opportunity during the day, they can do so in other formats. And in fairness, I think we're developing an increasing amount of our resource online. So a lot of the presentations we do, a lot of the workshops we do now, we now capture via film, so people can use that, and it's then making that accessible to them. Quite agree.
Okay. Councillor Maureen Powell.
Quick.
That's what I like to hear, Maureen.
Yeah. Is it, when it changes over to new curriculum, will the schools be able to have that previously? Because the year group that's going to take GCSEs that year, how can they suddenly go into new curriculum they haven't seen before? Is there going to be a
transition?
A
Yeah.
transition.
So what? If you look at the timeline, the national mission document that is sets out the timescales for change, it would be the Year 7 who go in 2022. It would be the first to have the secondary version of that new curriculum, if you like. They would then transition into the new qualifications 2025 in Year 10. So there would be that natural, not to say that secondary schools don't need to engage and think about how that's going to look and trial some of those approaches now, because that would be beneficial. But that's the approach. But likewise, primary schools now, those learners are there in Year 3. So you would expect to see the development of that curriculum through their pathway too. Okay.
Thank you, James. Any other comments or questions on this aspect? Louise?
I mean, it's just a very quick one. I mean, I very much would like to, hear from the pioneer schools, because I think there is a primary and secondary school, and hope that we're able to do so and how they're finding it. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I think one thing we need to do is to share the messages coming from not just the pioneers in Monmouthshire, but actually across Wales, in terms of the different approaches that are being taken and what the challenges they are experiencing as they're developing this as part of their model. Quite agree.
Okay, well, James, thank you very much for that very comprehensive slide presentation. Obviously, and thank you as well to AS as a group today for presenting. And I know we've got to get away now, but one thing I would say, I think it would be very useful to have you back later on in the year, later on in 2019 for an update. It's obviously a changing picture, and it's something that we obviously need to be fully aware of. I know some of us are on governing bodies. Many of us are on governing bodies, either in primary or secondary schools. It has outlined what's happening, and you've answered many questions. I think, taking Louise's point, I think it would be good to have some pioneer schools come in, perhaps a primary and a secondary, just to say what it's like on the ground in terms of the new curriculum. It will obviously be different to England, but I'm fairly confident about that myself. But thank you very much. We certainly will welcome you again. I hope it hasn't been too much sort of reminiscent of the Lion's Den. I'm not going to say what Alan Sugar says, okay? But thank you very much. Okay, well, we've had quite an intense morning, really, between free school meals and now the new curriculum. I think it's certainly something to think about. We now move, only 3 items left, fairly brief. Obviously, the CYP committee forward work plan. Hand over to Hazel.
Thanks, Chair. The next meeting is the 9th of July, and you'll see we've got the corporate plan and annual report of the Chief Officer there. This would be the annual report for Julie Boothroyd, because you've already had the annual report for Will McLean at the last meeting. Also, we've got the partnership agreement, which was deferred off today's meeting, and your points are noted around that, and I believe the chair is going to take that up with Will.
Yes, I will.
And we've also got a budget monitoring report. So we're looking then to the next regular meeting being the 17th of September, and then there's the 12th of November is the following one. So bearing in mind today's items and what you've agreed, would you be wanting to invite EAS back and to talk on both items or one of the two? And noting what Councillor Brown has said in terms of the latter item, you'd like to have a discussion about the pioneer schools. But were you expecting both items to come back, Chair?
Councillor Grocott.
I certainly think it would be useful to get a primary and a secondary head here from our pioneer schools.
Yeah.
We, Shire Newton, obviously, in Councillor Brown's ward, and King Henry VIII is also it's a pioneer secondary. So it would be great just to hear, because obviously they're working with their clusters now in developing and training, and I think it would be really good just to hear from a school's perspective what's going on.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. I think in particular schools they also have, you know, the lead person in this area who's involved in it. So it's useful to have them as well if we can.
I'd like to add in, I think, at some point in the later autumn, if we could get a secondary school and a primary school to talk about their perspective on free school meals, and possibly ones that are not in the green category. I don't know if that's if members would be happy with that or think it's a good suggestion. I'd be guided by the committee.
Yeah, I think the more we sort of, you know, have more of a sort of a practical orientation on what's actually going on in the schools, the better, actually. And, you know, we can find out ourselves about good practice as well. Thank you.
We'll do that, I think, probably in November, I would think, into the late autumn. I think that's the forward planner dealt with. Sorry, Peter.
Sorry, just one item. Given that Mountain House will no doubt feature in our future discussions, could I ask at the issue about the date of the dates for the decision-making process actually be recorded in the minutes, that we want to know urgently, or at least as soon as possible, when it will be considered at Cabinet, and whatever dates will be relevant, such as the consultation dates and so on. I'm aware that the Chair is going to take it up individually with Will McLean, but I would like to see that recorded in the minutes that the committee want these things.
That is one of the actions that I will undertake now after this meeting, to ask for those dates. As I say, I can't give that information. Unfortunately, Will is not here today, but that was on my sort of to-do list. Louise,
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, the timetable was that the consultation responses were going to come out at the end of May, and then it was basically that the 5th of June was the Cabinet decision-making thing. Now, I understand locally that has been extended, but my concern is either to ensure that it goes back to Cabinet either the beginning of July or in September, because otherwise, if this committee wants to look at it again, then we're in a bit of a difficulty, because we'll be in the August period if we're not careful. You know, so I think it's important that we've got dates on a new timetable on the date when the consultation extended ends, when we're going to get the basically when we're going to get the consultation response report, when it's going to go to and when it's going to go to Cabinet, but bearing in mind school term dates and everything like that. And you know, if this committee wanted, I mean, it to come back, you know, it has to come back within 15 days or something like that. Well, if it went to Cabinet at the end of July, then a lot of us will be away in August, and so, you know, that would frustrate the constitutional process in terms of scrutiny and so forth. So those dates are important. Thank you.
What I will ask for is a comprehensive timetable of all those key dates, so that, you know, we can be clear then what is happening when. And I agree with Councillor Louise Brown. We need to have time to, consider the responses. I mean, it can't be done in a couple of days. But for my part, I will email Will after today's meeting and ask for a comprehensive timeline on what is happening in terms of Mountain House, which I think is obviously very, very important, that particularly for the school and for staff, pupils and parents, and obviously this committee. Okay. 9, Council and Cabinet Work Planner, just noted, or...?
It's for noting, Chair, it's for members to identify anything within that planner that they feel they would like to bring forward for scrutiny. But has anybody got anything that they've identified they'd like to discuss aside from the issues you've obviously just mentioned, really?
Okay, well, we move now then to 10, and obviously it has been mentioned, but obviously next meeting now is 9th of July, and obviously pre-meeting at 9:30 and full meeting at 10. Thank you very much for your attendance today and for your inputs. I think it's been quite a long meeting, but it's been, I think, useful. I've certainly learnt quite a bit this morning, and it's been good to have EAS in here on FSM and on the curriculum. But thank you very much for your time and efforts this morning. Diolch yn fawr. I just wanted to say as well, thank you very much, Leanne, for all your efforts on this committee. Certainly, I know I've been not in the chair, but obviously part of the group for 2 years. We've all certainly welcomed your inputs, and it's very good to have that input from, as it were, the shop floor in a sense, and from parents and from children. But thank you very much for your efforts, and I look forward obviously to meeting your replacement. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure Mike will be being able to represent the Manchester Association of School Governors until somebody else can be put in place in November at the AGM. Yeah? Because you're going to be here anyway. So.
Well, you've shared a microphone. I think you can share the brief now. Thank you very much.